Hello and welcome back to the Harbor YouTube channel. I'm John, joined today by Dawn, and Harbor is back in full swing in our VBS summer series. And this last meeting, we looked at a classic old story, the story of David and Goliath. Dawn led us through some content on that. So, Dawn, for those who couldn't make it to the meeting, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we looked at when we looked at the David and Goliath story?
Sure. Thanks, John. So I want to start first with our craft, which was just, I love anything that just turns things around and turns things upside down. And one of our folks brought a craft to us of painting rocks with words and images of hope, of kindness, and of love. And she talked about the idea of taking what in this story is a weapon and turning it into instead a message of love. And that was just a great place, I think, to start our storytelling. We had a lot of fun trying to retell the story. It turns out the story that we know for most of us when we were kids was pretty simplified and pretty short. Basically, David and Goliath show up at the battle line. Goliath says some words, David says some words, David throws his slingshot, and Goliath gets hit in the head. And as we went through some of the details, we realized that there were parts that this story is linked very much to David being anointed as a young boy as the next king of Israel. And so this is part of the narrative that will bolster David's legitimacy as king. And I'm going to look at my notes here. And that this is really, so it's not so much a story about a war between the Israelites and the Philistines as it is a story about David, about his cunning, about his courage and skill, but also more importantly, his righteousness, because he's all like, God's on my side and we're going to win because God believes in us and not in you, which is interesting because his whole motivation for doing this in the first place has nothing to do with defending God's honor. He's after Saul's daughter. He wants to get in with the royal family, and he hears that the one who kills the giant Goliath will be the one who wins the daughter. So that's his whole motivation. But then he gets on the battlefield and it's all about God and God being on their side. And of course, we know the result. David's stone hits the giant in the forehead. The giant falls. You may or may not have heard as a kid that David then cuts off the giant's head and brings the head to Jerusalem. The part I was curious about, and I asked the group, was what were the morals of the story that we were taught? And I remember, and a lot of people kind of resonated with this. What I remember is, especially because I still am a short person, but I was also like a pretty short kid, and often underestimated, and being like the idea that small but mighty, right? Like, doesn't matter how big you are, if you've got God on your side, you will win. That was the moral for me. And then the other moral that came up was maybe more an adult version, was how Goliath becomes this metaphor for whatever sin or temptation we are battling at the moment. And so to try and, like David, to rely on God and remember that God is on your side. So those were some of the morals that we've been taught over the years. And then in our small groups, we may have talked about some more ideas that we've come out of that. Then we listened to Dr. Will Gaffney in a sermon she preached at Princeton, fast forwarding, not to the end of David's life, but while he's still, at this point, he's a mercenary because he's had to flee Saul's army because of his love for Jonathan. So he's had to flee from Saul, and he's joined this mercenary army of, guess who? Philistines. And they are going to battle against the Amalekites. And what we learn in Dr. Gaffney's sermon is, and from the Old Testament, is that the annihilation and that David creates just destroys every man, woman, and child, even destroys the land, which was apparently the whole point of this in the first place. And how these stories of David, these more violent stories, and there are many of them about the bloodshed that he caused, become what Dr. Gaffney called collateral damage to the image of David as this holy and righteous king and leader. And then we started to think about war. And so then I kind of shift gears to think about some of the wisdom we know from the nonviolence movement, particularly a quote from Gandhi from 1926, where he's like, this anti-war movement is great. I wish them all the best. But until we deal with the root of this violence, which is ultimately human greed, it won't work. And until we can convince, for him, those who are colonizing nations, the Americans and the English, to change their spirit of greed, we will continue to be violent. It's inevitable. And the idea of how do we address conflict creatively without going to war? Are we even capable of figuring that out? And then finally, just the question of whose side is God on? In these war stories throughout the Bible, and I mean, we hear this in the New Testament too, about how God is on the side of the righteous. But also, what we hear even more so from the prophets is that God is on the side of the poor, and God is on the side of the oppressed. And so if God is on the side of the poor, who is God then against? And where does that place some of us? And are we even comfortable thinking about God in that kind of binary way? So
Yeah.
it did go quite a few directions. The part I thought was most interesting was how, that idea of don't meet your heroes. Like, once you start kind of peeling back the layers of David, you realize what kind of person ultimately Jesus ends up being a descendant of, which is also interesting.
Yeah. I'm curious what else you are taking away from the conversation that we had as a group, because we covered a lot of ground, and thank you for doing a great job summarizing it here. I know for me in our group, one of the questions we wrestled with in the discussion room was, okay, we've talked about a lot of the morals of the story that we were taught or given as children or as adolescents in church. But what about now? What about with all that we now know about David? Now we've met our hero, David, and seen who he really is. Like, what do you take away from the David and Goliath story right now? Is there something to take away? And we spent a good amount of time wrestling with that. It's hard to come up with what might be good life-giving takeaways from this story, a ruthless story of brutality and death. And I think some of the thoughts, and this is, we're going to need to continue to wrestle with this over time, but some of the thoughts were going back to the craft, right? I think that you did a great job describing. Sarah from Arkansas brought us this craft of painting rocks. The idea that we can look at a story and say, I lament what happened in this story. Even if David's being presented as a hero, I see what he's doing in this story, and it's sad. It makes me sad. But what could I do differently? Could I paint rocks instead of throwing them at people's heads? And what would it look like to shift from violence, not the like big violence of war, but just like violent mentalities, violent practices that may go under the radar? How do we shift to nonviolence in our everyday lives? So those are some of the things I started thinking about in our conversation. I'm excited to keep thinking about. I love the Gandhi quote that we read about nonviolence. I'm curious, was there a big a thing that's kind of been sticking with you from the conversation that we had?
we we were really, I think our conversation was a lot about who David is. And one of the phrases that we talked about was that David was a man after God's own heart. Is one of the things that we are told about David. And in one way, that's a real comfort and a grace that as long as we are pursuing God, it's not that our harm doesn't matter, but that really, as long we can never be outside of God's embrace, no matter how awful we feel about what we've done. It can also be a bit of an excuse. It's one of those phrases that kind of covers all manner of sins, right? But he is after God's own heart. And one of what we had Larry in our group who's just has studied under rabbis, has studied for many, many years, and said one of the things that's taught about David is that no matter what he did wrong, he always, when he was confronted, he would always repent and rend his clothing. And so that's really what we're supposed to honor about David, is his ability to see what he's done wrong. But then I kind of wondered, but does he ever learn?
Yeah. Does he make amends? Does he repair the damage? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So I don't think we came away with any kind of really good solution about David, except a little bit of comfort in how complicated and how sometimes very, very kind of grim and shadowy a character he is. And also that he is one that God dearly loved. So that was about as close as we got with David. Just that complexity of his character, especially as the one who's attributed with writing many of the songs.
Yeah. Wow. Well, so much to think about. It was a great conversation in the group, and this has been a great conversation today. Below, everyone watching below, we will drop some links, the coloring page for our David and Goliath VBS coloring, some links, the link to Will Gaffney's sermon that Don mentioned, and some more helpful links below. Don, thanks for chatting today.
Thanks. Great to see you.